Thank you for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my conversation, awesome dialogue with my friend Christopher. And we initially had this conversation planned to talk about the Circling into Dialogos course that we teach, both of us teach with John Vervaeke. That's going to be February 10th and 11th. That's February 10th and 11th. The course starts at 10 a.m. and ends at 4 p.m. both Saturday and Sunday. There is a early bird discount of $100 up until 2 weeks before the course. So if you know you're going to do it, go ahead and sign up right away so you can make sure and get the discount. We talk about I think the general flow of the weekend, but the weekend is essentially a series of deeply participatory practices, layered practices that build up into what we call dialectic and dialogos, which we do on Sunday. Everything from meditation to philosophical contemplation to we do about 3 hours of circling. And it's really a deep dive and a layer of a steady progression of it, building up of skills and capacities to emerge into what we've been calling dialogos. And so Chris and I discussed that. I just want to let you know that we talked for like 3 hours. We had a 3-hour intense conversation before we hit record. So we kind of start the conversation at the deep end of the pool, I think. So I hope you're able to follow along. But we talk a lot about Aporia, and we talk a lot about the way that this work and practicing philosophy in the deepest sense isn't just about kind of higher level cognitive skills. That philosophical issues is at the very ground. It's something that our limbic system organizes itself around. Philosophy as much takes up the process of life as it does anything. So we were both really present to this, and that's what a lot of the dialogue was about, and relating all of that to the course and what the course means and what the implications of the course are and why we teach it. So I really hope you enjoyed this conversation and have a wonderful day.
Yeah, just keep going.
Which is often the case with Chris and I. We intend to get together and do a video, and then we start talking, and about 3 hours later, after we got done talking, we realize we haven't recorded anything, right? So we're in the midst of essentially, I think, a conversation that I think it's at the heart of the why. We teach Dialogos, what calls it into being, what it's really touching in on, and just having some really a way recently that life has situated itself where it shows it in a way that makes it, it's not just ideas, it's not just concepts, it's not attaining any knowledge, but at some deep level you can touch in on what philosophy in the deepest sense of the word is addressing is something that's actually kind of going on all the time, and it's organizing our very limbic system, right, in our relationships and how we show up. And that there's times in life that you go through something and something you have a relationship and something you become transparent to each other in such a way that you touch on the horizon that even brings that together, that you realize you have no word for what that is, right? But this eros, right, initiates you somehow beyond yourself, and this way that the way that on some level it's really interesting, because usually when people think about philosophy, they think about dissertations, and they think about this kind of analytical structures and all of that kind of stuff. But in the original sense of the word, if you look at the dialogues, it's anything but that. It's these
Mm.
dramatic interactions that somehow actually reveal something that you can't, that disassembles your categories.
Yeah.
And then you realize, like, oh, I've always seen through these categories, right? I've been thinking I've just, the world is like that, and that's, there's some
Yeah.
permanence there. And
That's right.
then you like fall in love with somebody, and like all of a sudden, like, you, someone's occupying a new center, and like that's never happened before, and like all of your categories break, and then everything looks different, and you realize, like, oh shit, I've been seeing with all these things. And so, in some level, a lot of people think about philosophy as the buildup of these things, the substantiating of these things. But in the participatory form that we're talking about with Dialogos, circling into Dialogos, is actually entering into, and in some sense inviting the seeing through of these things, the that thing that Eros does when it touches you.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. The dissolution of the categories.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The calling of everything into question. But even that's misleading, right? Because it sounds like a concrete epistemic question. It sounds like skepticism,
Yeah.
right? Which isn't what we mean. It's not an epistemic skepticism. I mean, there epistemic skepticism, at least in one register, is sort of a feature of it. It's like the propositional feature of it, but it's really doesn't get to the heart of it, does it? It's much more dispositional.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
that realization that, hang on, the way that the world is organized in front of me is not essential necessarily. It's also a property of how I'm relating to it.
Yeah.
And if I was to have a different relationship to it, or if there was a different relationship at the center of my attention that organized it differently, there would be things in it that I would see completely differently. And the way that it arrayed itself in front of me, in me, with me, alongside me, whatever spatial metaphor seems most appropriate, none of them quite do it,
Yeah.
would everything might seem different. Everything might seem otherwise to me. It could. And so there's this sort of de-essentialization of one particular way of relating to life.
Yeah.
And that can be very dizzying.
Mm-hmm.
That can be very dizzying if it's not anchored in a process that I think has some sturdiness to it,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like you need to almost have a relational sturdiness
Yeah.
or structure to be a companion in that process of dissolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, the dissolution can be very dizzying, but
Yeah.
the dissolution of the categories of attention and organization can also be the beginning of so many beautiful and important things if it's somehow accompanied by the sense of good faith that comes with doing it with in the doing it, how do we want to put it, Guy? Doing it in
Mm-hmm.
with the companionship of something that is more intuitively real
Yeah.
than the categories that are being dissolved. Does that
Yeah.
make any sense?
Yeah. And that's, I think, the ritual part of it. That
Right.
way that a ritual is an enacting symbol. And that way that a symbol, right, gathers, it instantiates, right, something that isn't the thing that's instantiating, but it's gathered in such a way such you see through it, right, and it starts to organize. It's like in the way a ritual, like, is a way of enacting, right, that very pattern, such that it becomes transparent. Yeah, but there is that structure part of it. There is that structuring part of it, like, and I think that's the, it's kind of like with the, why, in the way that in John's language, the ecology of practice and layering. In some sense, you could think about it as like each thing has a ritual. You could think about it as a practice, and you're practicing in some sense in a meditative sense of the word, in a contemplative sense of the word, in a relational sense of the word. You're, in some sense, enacting a practice that where you're consciously embodying, right, symbolically a a virtue or an ideal of something, right? Like, so like in meditation and mindfulness, you're going kind of back and forth in the centering, and you're doing all these things that you're kind of embodying and practicing some sense of beyondness, but embodying it, right? And you're going through this kind of ritual, like to try to become more transparent to something, right? And then there's the next layer and the next layer and the next layer. And then like when we go into dialectic, into dialogos, right? In some way, there's this kind of way, we were talking about this earlier, where marriage in this way is kind of like especially in the Christian tradition is like a symbol of a macrocosm of the entire cosmos. That somehow a marriage, right, is a symbol that like shows you it's like the whole thing is going on in a marriage, right? And so in some sense a relationship or a marriage is enacting the whole pattern in some way. And and in that sense of the word, like that I think is something like I would imagine. I think that is something like the this that right structure, right, that holds you as you kind of is it what it opens up to, right, is something beyond all that structure in some deep sense.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So that the structure is a dramatization,
Yeah,
of some pattern, some process that isn't reducible to that structure, but that structure is an imitation. It's mimetic. And it's what it's trying to do is just capture, it's like an extract,
yeah,
of some pattern that can't quite be tamed, but it's an attempt to tame something that can't be tamed.
yeah,
And knowingly, so there's an irony in that. You
yeah,
used an interesting you made a turn of phrase a moment ago, and you said that, what did you say? That the person becomes transparent to the process, or the person becomes transparent to the structure,
yeah,
rather than the structure becoming transparent to the person. Now,
yeah,
it could be both,
yeah,
but I thought it was interesting that you said, no, it's the person who becomes transparent to the structure, which sort of implies that the person becomes the structure,
yeah,
becomes the process. When we
yeah,
were talking a little bit before you started recording, you and I, about this really uncanny experience where you find yourself, and I don't know, maybe in finding yourself this way, you sort of suspend it for a moment, but experiencing yourself as becoming basically coextensive with the process,
yeah,
where you're not autonomous and atomized, you're not independent, you're
yeah,
not some separate entity
yeah,
and cleanly separable from whatever it is that you're doing. You just are the process that you're undertaking.
yeah,
Right. So when you're in a dialectic and you're dissolved into the process, you are the process. There's no real,
mhm,
there's no apparent difference in the field of attention and experience. There's no apparent difference between you and the process,
yeah,
right? Or like
yeah,
when you're powerfully in relation to somebody,
yeah,
whether it's in dialogue or it's in,
yeah,
something else that's intimate, you're just experiencing yourself as an almost that whatever self, whatever sense of independent self, almost feels like an epiphenomenal offshoot of the relation itself,
yeah,
rather than coming before the relation. It seems to come after it,
yeah,
in a vertical sense, right?
yeah, yeah, totally,
If
totally.
that makes any sense at all, I don't know.
Well, it just makes a whole lot of sense when you like think about when you think about the Platonic dialogues, right, and you think about it as an enactment of this of these relationships, particularly with Socrates, that in some sense, like they're so mercurial and hit these aporias, but then it's like something happens in that aporia, right, where like everyone's enacting the thing that they can't talk about, right? Almost unbeknownst to them, right? That there's that yeah, it's that way that there's something about the structure, the ritual, the relationship, right? That that becomes, it can thin out to its own ground for a moment and reconfigure everything, right? In some way, like that sense of, yeah, that sense of like really consciously, like reaching into, and through dialogue, through questioning, through exercises, through like interpersonal exercises, right, through meditation, through all these ways, is in some senses something such that you can become transparent to the thing that goes beyond all that form and that structure, right? The the, the ground of its situation, right? Like, is which is something that is is deeply apophatic when it comes down to it, and can really put you in between your categories, and like, and when you start to like, when some intimation of that, like you kind of have an experience, right, or you have the experience of getting something that you like had thought you got before, and then you really get it at this whole other level, and then you have this experience of profoundness about that, and then you kind of come back and you realize that none of my ways of organizing the world has can account for this, right? There's an opening up that goes on there. There's an opening up that goes on there. And like,
Yeah.
and I think that starts to be kind of the beginnings of that. If that Because if you start shifting your categories, you become someone different, right?
You do. Yeah, yeah. Well, because the things you pay attention to, the things that you hold in the greatest orders of realness are different, right? It's the figure ground reversal, right? Something in the background suddenly becomes the foreground, or something that was in the foreground as an incidental feature then becomes the whole background against which everything is situated.
Yeah.
And then nothing can be the same. The world just looks different. You reflected back on the surface of the world looks different. Everything changes.
Yes.
And that change is really hard to account for. And it's hard to anticipate. And I said this to you a little earlier. One of the things that always occurs to me, and I can't even qualify this statement in its exact meaning, but one of the things that always occurs to me, both about perhaps the life of an individual perspective, but also maybe that, things in general, is just this sense of incompleteness, right? We always think of the world as being finished. And if we could but discover all of the things that are already finished, we could know them, and then we would be knowledgeable or wise.
Yeah.
That the world is composed of things that already are, and whose being is determinate. And if we could but discover them and know them, then our account of things would be fuller. Yeah. And that just seems to me to be just not a satisfying way of accounting for the uncanniness of that experience.
Yeah.
Because it's much more like, no. As you said, you find you have these categorical ways of organizing the world and interacting with it. And then all of a sudden it becomes very obvious, because of an aporia, that the categories are not sufficiently accounting
Yeah.
for experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're not actually accounting for experience. They're not sufficiently telling you, they're not allowing you to predict it.
Yep.
And they're also not giving you the proper instruction for how to respond to it.
Yeah.
And then it becomes obvious that the categories are not operable.
Yeah.
And then you have to somehow let them go.
Yeah.
But there's the aporia, right? Because it's like, well, the categories I've been using to make sense of things in the world in my experience are not making sense of it.
Right. Right.
So either the world is inherently truly, truly absurd and unintelligible by its very nature, which is that's a pretty anxiety inducing prospect. And that is how all of this presents, is in the form of anxiety.
Yeah.
Or the categories have to be dissolved and then resolved around the reality of the contact with the experience and the quality of the relationship that seems to emerge from it.
Mm.
And then that transition is a very, very difficult thing, isn't it? Because you find yourself in this no place initially. Yeah. Everything feels maximally alive, but often at the same time very chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just supreme disorientation.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting is if you think about, like, in some sense, because it's one of the things that we talk about, right, in the practice is, and actually notice it, like, try to be in the presence of it, aporia. Like, in some sense, if you imagine, like, let's say something like the ability to hold myself and sustain the experience of aporia, right? Which is, as you were talking about, is like a surging, what is calling to be understood, which is the thing I'm experiencing. The categories that I have cannot grasp hold of it, right? Mm-hmm. But yet the realness of this experience, right? Like, it makes my categories in some sense obsolete, right? But then I'd have no way of categorizing it to experience it, right? Yeah. And that there's this, it's like there's this kind of dissolution. Yet at some sense, it's like that, but it also kind of leads to transformation, right? Because there's, on some level, like, there's that sense of, like, the if you put yourself at the limit of something, we could say in one way it's an end, and another way it's a beginning. So it's like there's something about holding oneself or sustaining oneself in tolerating and even wanting the experience of aporia.
And understanding that experience is actually part of the process of the world remaking itself through your understanding.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's maybe the hardest part, is the recognition, the felt recognition, the love of that part of the process as being a part of the process. Yeah. And it having a home, this remarkably dizzying experience.
Yes.
It having a home among the experiences that constitute something meaningful and transformative.
Yes.
Right. It's not like, and it's so tempting to feel it, understandably, as some kind of defeat, mm-hmm. or as the end.
Yeah.
But dealing with aporia then just becomes the most important part of the whole process. And also the aporia, we think of the aporia as being the moment. It's funny, I was thinking about this the other day. We think of aporia as being the moment when everything comes to a grinding halt. Mm-hmm. You know, when words fail and everything lapses into silence and everyone hits the wall and there's this great pregnant pause. But that's often not how aporia actually presents. Like I think you can be in aporia, like in a dialogue, for instance, like in a dialectic, you can be in aporia for like 20 minutes
Mm-hmm.
without ever having named it that, when you can just feel that everyone's chafing against a formulation of something that's not actually opening anything.
Yeah.
It keeps foreclosing, it keeps chafing, it keeps that everyone's struggling over something and are unwilling to let it go, even though it's not working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is what we do all the time with everything, right?
Yeah.
And and you can be in the state of aporia to have met a dead end for a very long time before actually looking at it and going, hang on,
Yeah.
this is an aporia. Like,
Yeah.
I'm trying to push my way through something and it's not letting me through because something about the way that I've framed the situation does not yield anything.
Yes.
Nothing.
Yes.
I've framed the situation in such a way that it's not opening anything.
Yeah.
And I've been struggling with this problem for the last 20 minutes. That's just in the context of the practice, or it could be, for the last 2 months or for the last year, for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
I've been under the assumption that this situation is complete and I simply have to take its completeness and somehow get better at it.
Mm.
When it feels far truer to say that no, the revelation of what this is by nature is not actually complete. And instead of chafing against it, I need to somehow recognize that there's something that I've exhausted. Oh, it's so difficult to put words to this, isn't it, sometimes, Guy? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I've exhausted a particular way of formulating this.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
I need to let it go.
Yes.
I need to let it go.
Yeah.
And there's a way in which these things fit together. They can, they do.
Yeah.
But they don't fit together this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Like trying to make these puzzle pieces fit. And I can't find the right match.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to try and jimmy it in. It's like, no, you can't.
Yeah. Yeah. And that in some sense, this all of this, I think symbolically, again, back to like the dialogues, right? You know, in so many cases, philosophy awakens with eros, right? It's like you start to like there's an erotic start to this, right? An idea, like a virtue, a sense of something. Like there's a in the beginning of a lot of the dialogues, it's kind of like there's this process of eros that starts to happen, which is the thing that takes you into the inquiry, right? Into the process. And it's kind of funny because I got this picture of that, right? Like, yeah, and it's interesting because you think about like mythically, Eros and Psyche is a very strange relationship. Like Eros basically tortures Psyche. It's this, it's this like this in some I've never quite looked at it like that until now, but this kind of as we're kind of talking about this impasse, this aporia, and like holding steady there, like there's something that like the very like struggle with it, the frustration of it, announces that some sense there's some relationship with beyond the aporia. There's like the fact that I'm frustrated that I can't figure it out, right? Like is intimating something, right?
Right. Yeah.
And there's something about that relationship with that frustration and something like sticking with it, like
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
holding to it, being with the experience, right? And this is like we're talking about this, like you can talk about this as like when we're trying to understand something or get something, but it's also this also could be this kind of reach these kinds of impasses in our own lives all the time
Oh
about
yeah.
like it's like to make it like there's a choice or a decision that needs to be made, and like I have no every ounce of my framing has no ability to know how to make that choice, right? And it's like that's like a participant, like that's an aporia that you live inside of, right? And it's funny because it's like oftentimes when we look back on it, we go through those experiences, we look back on them, we go, oh, like those are the key moments of like development, right? Those are the key moments of transformation, right? Those are these key moments, right? And that there's something about this kind of recognizing that you're in aporia and recognizing that that's the case, and like recognizing that something's calling, right, to me, and that calling is in the it's has something to do with this something connected with love, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and having a sense of that, just a little piece of that, affords you to kind of maybe sustain, right? Sustain in it, burn through it, right?
Burn
Like,
through it is a great way of putting it.
yeah,
Because you're being burnt. You're burning through it. It's burning through you, it feels more like.
yeah,
Doesn't
yeah,
it feel more like it's burning through you? You know the expression like this is giving me grief? Like I'm trying to work on something and it's giving me grief.
yeah,
It it's a weird expression, but you and I were talking earlier in our conversation before we started recording about grief and about the fact that the grief is something at whatever scale, right? Grief as a response to the permanent loss, finality,
yeah, yeah.
right? And we can think of that in all kinds of different registers, right?
Mhm.
And finality could refer to just a particular image of life, a particular image of the world, a particular sense of possibility that you had
Yeah,
that is now dead or dying.
yeah,
And that grief is the process of hanging with the aporia,
yeah,
staying with it, burning through it, being burned through by it. There's an emptying,
yeah,
there's a burning away, and that affects how you experience time and
yeah,
yourself and the definitions of yourself and the boundaries of yourself and all of those things that seem so tidy um and and there's something about when you've encountered something that is giving you grief and making you frustrated and angry and it happens in the practice a lot. Like you can see, obviously, at a certain scale, right? It's not like all of life that's being thrown into chaos by that. I would hope,
yeah,
but it's in a very modest. It's within a particular arena, right? Within certain boundaries, but you can see it happen when there's just a real like this proposal or this something about the process is just giving people grief,
yeah,
and you can feel the struggle.
yeah,
And there is a certain frame of mind, there's a certain perspective, there's a certain way of interacting with the practice, as with people, as with problems, that allows a person to hang with the grief, hang with the frustration. And it's not as though they're immunized from it. I don't mean like the reflectiveness gap of, dissociating from it and no longer being invested or concerned and therefore gaining some kind of fascinating distance.
yeah,
I don't really mean that.
yeah,
But I mean a way of loving the pain of the grief while in the grief enough to hang with it and to see the possibility of value on the other side of it. And on that other side of it, you will have reformed around it, changed to the degree that now you will become such a person who
yeah,
can make sense of very pieces that are not fitting together.
yes,
And at least incrementally, at least 1 degree more than you could a minute ago.
yeah, totally.
And whatever it is that allows us to hang with the grief
Mhm.
and stay in it and be in it and be in the aporia and be overcome with the frustration of it without completely succumbing to the frustration of it, but understanding it as part of the process,
Yeah.
and being able to bear it.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the companionship, the sense of fellowship, becomes so crucial, because the fellowship is what makes the suffering of aporia bearable, sufferable, so that you can hang with it better. It's hard to hang with aporia solo.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I mean, unless you're someone with an incredibly fortified kind of faith. It's hard to hang with aporia solo.
Yeah.
And there's something about the fellowship component, the philia, that actually makes the aporia, that beautifies it not aesthetically, but I mean sees the good in it, and midwives from it a sense of hope that there is still good within the mess of the aporia.
Yeah.
To be suggestive that there is another side to it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And it's funny as we were talking about this, just imagining, I'm just sensing this kind of real, this way. Well, I'm thinking about vulnerability, right? The experience of being vulnerable, right? In some sense of like, because it's got that, there's this way, it's like the difference between, I often like to talk about the difference between kind of the feeling of being exposed and then the experience of being vulnerable, right? Like, it's like in some sense we're like talking about this turning, like the difference is in vulnerability. I become vulnerable by virtue of turning toward it, right? Or I could feel like super exposed, and then I can kind of just turn towards that, and it becomes something like vulnerability, right? And then you kind of start to think about vulnerability as a kind of way of talking about becoming more transparent to something, right? Like there's that I think it's almost that talks about like this enigmatic thing that I think Jesus said somewhere in the Bible. It says like may the meek inherit the earth. And almost made this talk where he's kind of like, what the hell? What does that even mean? May the meek, and he kind of talked about it like, well, if you think about it, like, like to that the process of becoming vulnerable, right? He says, to be human is to be the most vulnerable creature that we know about, right? Like longest gestation period, the least amount of instincts. And he talks about like, whereas an alligator, right? Not as vulnerable, right? But we're really vulnerable. And he's like, so to be human, right, is to be really vulnerable. And therefore not many of us are very interested in being human. It's like he talked about it like, and to the degree that I'm not interested in that, right, is to the degree that I'm going to then put a shell around me. And here's the paradox: the moment I put a shell around me is the moment I become brittle.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. It's absolutely, and fail to be human. Fail to embrace and integrate the very quality of humanness that is the very kind of fragility and finitude that makes the abundant life actually possible.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
And then when you see it in the sort of transhumanism ideologies and movements, right, that are so fixated on trying to try and immunize humanity against its own frailties and fragilities.
Yeah.
When it's the very frailties and fragilities that actually brace the possibility of, the moment's meaningfulness. And, but it's just, I mean, it's a good reminder that we don't fully understand our own humanity.
The way he put it was like he's the other paradox with this is like as you just it's like you just start to become vulnerable, like, and you just become transparent. Like you get become transparent to like, there's different levels of you and layers to you. And like as you become transparent to it and vulnerable to it, right? And other people see that and you see it, right? You can go down another level, another layer. He's like, at some point, right? If you go all the way down, right? You're totally vulnerable all the way down, all the way to the level of like being itself, right? Or the good itself. Just paradoxically, you're not vulnerable at all at that point, right? And thus
Mm.
the meek shall inherit the earth was the way he took that and rode that. And I always really appreciated that our vulnerability is already in some sense even that in that we can be vulnerable, in that that any part of us is inclined to be, right? Like is already in some sense recognizing something very profound like that, right? So it's not. It's like in some sense sticking with the aporia, right? There's some relationship to this kind of depth that 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 is in some sense this kind of process of vulnerability in a very very deep way, in a very participatory way. Yeah,
Yeah.
really
And
good
there's
being with
something
you, my friend.
that, what did you say, Guy?
Good being with you, my friend.
Ah, good being with you too. It
Yeah,
always is.
yeah.
It always is. It always is.
I will put the dates. I think we have the core. I'll put all this stuff in the show notes and stuff like that. But the
The
dates.
date for the workshop is February 10th and 11th, Saturday, Sunday.
Yep. And there's a discount and stuff beforehand, so
Yep. An early bird
you can
discount.
register, do it now, so you can not pay as much. And yeah, I'll put this up on my channel and and I'll put all the details of that and there'll be a place if you have any questions and all this stuff will be in the show notes as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, we hope to see you there. It's always I'm always really impressed at just the people who are there. It's always just a really good group of people.
Yeah.
Smart and engaged and and uh and very generous.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really generous. Just come to play and just come and jump in and with just a real sort of spirit of discovering what it is that's going on here.
Yeah.
And the process help to create it,
Yeah.
co-create.
Yeah. It's like there's something about the just I mean having for the last since I was like in my early 20s been some kind of teacher of some kind, right? Like and experienced a lot of groups. There's something about who I found who shows up to these. Is this real these it's like a it's the people where two things come together that like stereotypically aren't together in one person. On one level, there's like somebody who's kind of deeply like emotionally attuned and aware and wanting to be aware and awake to that dimension of life. But usually people who are awake to that are like kind of like they prefer just not to think that much or analysis and intellect and stuff like that are just that's not their thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other side of the spectrum is somebody completely in their head, right? Like, totally analytical, but completely like not in their body, right? They're kind of a floating head or something like that. If you say those are the two stereotypes or whatever. But there's something about what comes together in dialectic and in circling into Dialogos course that draws in this place where people really like both things are really mutually together. And there's something about that. Um, there's something about that it creates a tonos, right? An atmosphere, a container of that it leads to just some real exceptional experiences of fellowship, which is which is
It
what
does.
which is, I think that we're kind of, if we're gonna be really interested in reality and being and really genuinely wanting to become transparent to it, right? In some sense, we got to do it together.
Well, it's the companionship thing again, right? It's
Yeah.
you need other people to help bear aporia,
Yeah.
bear the frustrations, the things that really, really are vexing. And that's, I think, another thing what this produces for people. It has for me, it has for you too, right? I mean, this is a good example of it. It also produces the possibility of new friendships and relationships and new people that can help reflect things back at you that only they could reflect back at you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's that component of all of this. And it's not, it's not as though these workshops are organized with the explicit intent of producing relationships, nor should they be, I think. But the practices and the practice is at the center of it. But one of the things that happens in the throes of the practice is that you just encounter people and encounter new ways of encountering people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that tends to produce the combination thereof tends to produce some really interesting, meaningful, and very animated new relationships.
Yeah.
And new relationships bring things online, so to speak, in our lives that weren't online before. They activate parts of us that weren't active before. New things open as a consequence of this. So there's sort of the practice and the sort of the philosophical practice and the relational practice at the center of the workshops and that structure the weekend and graduate the skills and nest the skills together in the different capacities. But then there's that thing around the margins that happens too, which is the informality of getting to encounter a lot of people who synthesize and bring together different traits that don't ordinarily belong together, but that end up belonging together. And in belonging together, produce ways of interacting that maybe weren't available before, which is, to me, the most interesting and spontaneous part of the whole affair.
Yeah, totally. You brought this up, actually, you brought this up a while ago, and I'm thinking about this since. And I think you were talking about like I think most of the time people experience like relationship, right? The bonding of the relationship is somehow connected through like experiences together through time, right? Having participated in this event over and over again, and in that shared history, right, becomes the thing that's like binding of the relationship. And I think you said, but we all have had that experience where like you can actually know someone your whole life and share all this history, but you've never really gone there with them,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this, you could say that like a lot of the time that I think we can confuse depth, right, for length of time. But then there's this other way where it's like a relationship, you can actually not even have any history with anyone, and an engagement of the verticality can open up, right? The depth dimension, right, in some sense. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's interesting to kind of like to come together in fellowship and to experience something together and then have that vertical dimension open up, right? And I think in a lot of times, right, this is I mean, I'm watching this in the art of circling right now, where like every week I'm they're going through these intense experiences where this kind of depth opens up, right? And they have this incredible experience, right? And and it starts to attune them, right? It sets a precedence, right? Of like, it's like, whoa, I didn't know that you could have this experience or this sense in a relationship. Like that was wild. And then kind of in some sense, it's like as if they um their nervous system becomes like a tuning fork, it gets it hits a tone, right? And then they go back in their lives, and like that tone, like different relationships, like register more out of sync or more with that sync. But this orientation to that tone allows something the world to disclose, right? Like because it's got a new telos or something, or a new horizon, right? That one it sets a precedence to and of course that you may have no idea how to do it, but you can start to be oriented that way and start to find and sync up your relations, right, with this
Yeah,
kind of depth, right?
exactly.
Yeah,
You know the tone. You've heard it once now. Like you know the tone exists, so now you know to listen for it.
yeah, totally, totally. Yeah.
You
So
know,
a
you
big
know
part
to
of this
listen
course is
for it.
like it's like really grounds, and like that's the circling aspect of it is really grounding in the reciprocal opening, right?
Mhm.
In that anagogic sense, right? Of like of the way that we open, horizontally to each other, right? Starts to create a verticality, right? A depth dimension
That's right.
opens up, and that's a big part of what the course is grounded in, and then as John likes to say, is like that in taking that intimacy and not just for its own sake, but then putting it in service, right, to
Exactly.
something like talking about a virtue, talking about looking at being, looking at reality.
Mhm. And then bringing it back into the horizontal dimension, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
'cause you ultimately, I think we need the two. We need the
yeah,
two together,
yeah,
right? And sometimes you can have a lot of the horizontal in your life without much of the vertical. And this is a chance to sort of sensitize to the vertical so as to be able to port some memory of it back into
yes,
the horizontal and find it there again. And then, boy, there's something about when that happens. That's pretty special.
yeah, yeah, totally, totally. All right,
All
really good
right.
talking with you,
Looking forward
Chris.
to it.
All right.
You too.
Mwah.
Thank you.
Bye.
As always.